he talks about how he was over, I don't know how many Satanists, call them churches. He was like the bishop.
You gotta be kidding me.
What was in her heart? You don't know what sin she'd committed. You don't know how much unbelief was there. You don't know whether she hated her husband.
I don't think so.
Why would anybody spend so much time ranting and raving about something that they don't believe in?
Really?
Welcome to Skeptics Brew Pub with Brother Brewer. Welcome to episode 23 of Skeptics Brew Pub. I'm your host, Brother Brewer, and tonight's episode is pre-recorded. Tonight it also happens to be Halloween, and so I am taking my youngsters out on that wonderful tradition of trick-or-treating. So, in the meantime, I did record a little conversation I had with a gentleman in Australia by the name of Garry Stevens, and he runs a podcast and website that's called History in the Bible, where he goes through the entire history of the Bible from the archaeological evidence and compares it with what we were taught in Sunday school, kind of a teaching the controversy kind of thing. And we do go quite a bit into that. I do have to apologize for the audio quality. The quality itself, I think, was very good, especially considering that we were interviewing basically across time zones. So while I was talking to him in the early evening hours, in the late evening hours here in the States, it was actually the next day or the next afternoon where he was. So we dealt with that. There were some planes flying overhead, so you may hear a few clips where the audio had to be cut and spliced back together. But overall, it was a very good interview. It was a lot of good content, and I do encourage you to go and check out his website and his podcast. He breaks it down into about 30-minute segments or 30-minute episodes, so you don't have to worry about having to get hit with everything all at once, like some other podcasts out there that try to do a history and it gets very long. I really enjoy listening to it myself, and so without further ado, let's go ahead and get started on the episode 23 with Garry Stevens, History in the Bible podcast. Good evening, this is Brother Brewer here at Skeptics Brew Pub again, and with me tonight is Dr. Garry Stevens from the History in the Bible podcast. How are you doing tonight, Doc?
I'm doing just fine, thank you very much indeed.
Now, do you prefer being called Dr. Garry, Dr. Stevens, Garry? How do you prefer to be?
Oh, strictly Garry. The doctor part doesn't get me a better table in a restaurant, and since it's a doctorate in sociology, it's almost silly to call me doctor.
Okay. Well, a lot of my friends, or a lot of the people that listen into this podcast, they might not be familiar with the History in the Bible podcast, so can you tell me a little bit about it?
Sure. The History in the Bible podcast, which I think is now up to episode 40-something, is my attempt to construct an interesting hobby and a topic I find absolutely fascinating, and it's tracing the history of the ancient Israelites and their successors in Christianity, etc., right from the very start of what we know about Hebrew history, right through. It will end with the end of Christianity, I suppose, as told in the Bible. Now, it's a history in the Bible, so I'm going through the Bible and discussing all the historical aspects that appear in every single book in the Bible. And that includes all the books which a lot of Protestants probably aren't familiar with, books which only appear in, say, the Catholic canon or in the Eastern Orthodox canon, books like Ecclesiasticus, Tobit, and that sort of thing.
Okay.
So it's a lot of fun, and I'm working my way linearly through history. Oh, plane, hang on. I'm working my way through history, and currently I'm just starting on the Two Kingdoms period, which is probably the least known, I think. Most people would know all the historical stories of Moses and Abraham and that sort of thing. But the history of the two independent kingdoms is pretty much far down on people's knowledge level.
Right. I'm pretty sure that a lot of people don't even realize that there were two kingdoms. Because when you think about it, you think of ancient Israel and you never say Judah, even though they were the ones that wrote a good portion of the history.
That's absolutely right. Most people wouldn't even know that there were two kingdoms. Although one was destroyed by the Assyrians and another was destroyed by the Babylonians. And I'll bet they couldn't name any
That might be, or here in the States, they might at least know Queen Jezebel, because she seems to be pretty popular nowadays.
That's true. They'd probably know Jezebel, but I'll bet they don't know the story.
You'd be surprised, actually, because here in the South, at least, anytime someone talks about a woman that is very outspoken and maybe a little bit free with herself, that's what they call her. They call her a Jezebel.
Oh, right.
So there's at least a little bit of familiarity with it.
She's got an undeserved rap.
That's true. Now, you said that you'd been studying this for a while, but that wasn't your background. You have a background in sociology?
I have a multifaceted background. I started off in architecture, actually. I got my degree in that, and it became blindingly clear I'd be an utterly incompetent architect, since I have no imagination. So I thought, well, better find something else to do. I got into computer-aided design, which back in those days was avant-garde, and we had computers the size of Belgium, basically. And I got into that, and then I got interested in sociology because I was interested in what would be the effects of computer-aided design on the profession. So I moved into sociology, and then basically I moved out of architecture entirely, and got interested in all sorts of sociology of, say, the ancient Israelites and that sort of thing. Nowadays, though, I work in IT. That's how I earn my bread and butter.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it sounds like what my father-in-law does. He basically started out back when you built your own circuit boards for your computers.
Right.
And he would work on those, and he's been working in IT from then all the way through to now. So you two might actually get along.
we might indeed. Although I must admit, for someone of my age, IT is a young person's industry, and I'm always the oldest fossil in the room. And when you're being interviewed by 12-year-olds, you're going, oh, no.
Yeah, well, I'm not 12, but, it's...
Okay, that was me muting again. I wish there was some sort of indicator I could do to indicate that the microphone's off and that I'm not actually dead or something.
Well, either way, I've been marking the times down, too, so we're good there. So I can go back and cut them out. What got you interested actually in these biblical studies? For me, it was a lot that I had grown up in a very fundamentalist Pentecostal home, and so I was surrounded with it and started looking into it that way. But what brought you into it?
I've been interested in the Bible since I was a kid, I think. Not in a particularly religious sense. My brother is the religious one in the family. I just found the whole thing just fascinating. And I borrowed lots of books from the library, which espoused a lot of modern ideas about the Bible. So they weren't apologetic books or how to reach God. They were dealing with the history. So I've had this interest for years. And a few years ago, I thought, well, I find the topic interesting. There's a lot of exciting material out there. So why don't I do something useful with it and make a podcast? And one of the nice things about podcasting is that I think we're pretty much all amateurs. I don't think there's very many, full-time academics out there doing this sort of stuff. We're passionate buffs, I suppose you'd call it.
Yeah, and it seems like some of the more professional ones seem to be a little bit dry too at times.
I'd agree with that. They do sound rather dry, don't they? Quite a lot of them, like they're giving lectures.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. But people like us, we can't claim any academic credibility, so we can't go out and write a book because no one would publish it.
Right.
They'd say, well, which university do you belong to? Well, no, I don't actually belong to any university. But podcasting, it gives you the chance to explore it. And I think one of the great things about podcasting is that you really are forced to learn things when you find that you have to explain them to someone else.
That's a pretty good point there. You mentioned on your website that biblical history has been going through quite a few revolutions since the 70s even. I know that I'm probably familiar with some of what you talk about on there, but the listeners may not be. What kind of things are we seeing that's different from maybe what we might have heard in a similar kind of podcast, say 60 years ago or so?
Yeah, basically everything changed in 1970. I think most people would carry around in their heads a vision of modern biblical studies and biblical archaeology, which was current at about 1960. And people would think that archaeology vindicates the entire history as laid out in the Bible, and that the Bible is an accurate guide to that history. And that was pretty much the case held by academics and archaeologists until 1970. And everything changed after that, with the death of one particular man, actually, William F. Albright. Now, he was a really smart guy. He was a one-man university. He was a biblical archaeologist and a historian, and a pastor too, I think, a preacher. And he dominated biblical archaeology right from the 30s to the time of his death. And he established an entire paradigm that the Bible was an accurate guide to the history. After his death, people started questioning things. And the archaeology got a lot better too. Until 1970, when people went digging in the Holy Land, it was all Indiana Jones. You know, we're looking for the temple, we're looking for the Ark of the Covenant. But we all know the Ark of the Covenant is in an Amazon fulfillment warehouse somewhere. So we found that, and that's where Indiana Jones put it. So until then, it was all treasure hunting. After 1970, biblical archaeologists started doing all the things which other archaeologists do, like, for example, field surveys. So you peg out, an acre of ground, and you meticulously dig it up and examine the artifacts. And that had not been done before. It just hadn't been done. So these large-scale field surveys created a whole amount of new information, which has completely changed the way we view the history in the Bible.
Okay.
Yeah.
I hate to cut you off there. Were you?
No.
Because one thing I was going to ask is, I know that some of the things that I had discovered rather early on when I really started digging into it was that there wasn't an Exodus, or at least we're not finding an evidence of one. Are there any other things like that we think maybe didn't happen, or at least didn't happen quite the way that they say that they did?
There seems to be no evidence for the patriarchs, for example, or at least the patriarchal stories told in the Bible. We can't fit Abraham and Isaac and Jacob into any period that they could possibly have lived in. The evidence from the Bible, for example, it mentions camels. Abraham and camels. Camels simply weren't there until about the time of King David. So that entire history has gone into the sort of maybe there were some people who had those roles of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and the other patriarchs, but there's no real evidence for them. So we have to put them into the story basket. And as you said, the Exodus. There is no evidence for the Exodus, certainly in Sinai, but there could have been something very similar. One theory which I find really intriguing is that the people who came out of Egypt were not the entire Hebrew nation, but they were the ancestors of the Levitical tribe, the Levites. Now, the archaeology is pretty conclusive now that the people we call the Israelites are, in fact, Canaanites. They were indigenous to the area. And what may have happened to turn them from Canaanites into the Israelites we know is that this group of people came out of Egypt. It could have been just a very small tribe, and managed to, well, I suppose, impose themselves on a certain group of Canaanites and construct a distinct ethnicity on that. So that's a different thing. The big debate today is now about the role of David and Solomon, the United Kingdom. How powerful were they? Did they actually exist? Well, it's now believed that they were real people. But did they build a temple? Was there a large city? For example, Jerusalem. The archaeological evidence seems to be pretty clear that in the time of David, Jerusalem was absolutely minuscule, somewhere between 500 to 1,000 people tops. It wasn't, a city on the hill. So this is one of the discoveries of archaeology. Now, this is all very contentious. The disappearance of the patriarchs into history and Exodus into history, that's pretty well established, and that was the debate of a generation ago. Today the big debate is about David and Solomon.
Okay, well, actually that theory does make sense.